Good morning, everybody. I've already told everybody, do not bother me. I've got to get through this chapter today. So it was so funny. And I left my phone out of here because the other day, from the time I went on air until my daughter was like, "Oh my God, mom, I need help." Um, my phone was ringing nonstop. So that obviously is not a good time of the day to be doing podcasts. Okay. So I want to jump right into um, the chapter that we're on, chapter 5. If you recall, it's called Shades of Gray. I'm going to quickly go over because I deleted the other one, not off of Rumble, but off of the other one, and I will delete it off of Rumble. So it's not just hanging out there looking dumb. So, Shades of Gray basically deals with a guy by the name of Robert Keith Gray. That's where she got the title for the chapter, Shades of Gray. She started off talking about Korea Gate kind of in a roundabout way. And I'm just going to go over the details of that really quick as she lays them out. She doesn't get into the actual allegations, but she's creating a foundation of people and players that will be very useful to us later on. And it's important that we understand how they kind of fit into the scheme so we can go back and refer to it later. So, Tunson Park is the name of a person. When I first saw that, I'm like, "Tunson Park? Where's that? I've never heard of it because it was talking about it in relation to a club that was formed in Georgetown, and I'm like, "I've been all over DC. I don't remember that one because it's a guy." Okay, so he lived in DC. He's of Korean origin, and he was recruited by the Korean CIA to be a businessman and to lobby corrupt, whatever word you want to use, politicians and businessmen in DC for the betterment of Korea. So the Korean prime minister at the time, Chung Il Kang, basically created this mission for Townsend Park to garner political influence in DC. Park worked with Congressman Richard Hanna from California because California had a large rice production capability. And so there was kind of a natural liaison between um, Korea and rice production. So that's kind of how he got made his in is through Congressman Richard Hanna. So their bartering of rice cells, the commission generated by Park, was used to fund his political influence campaign. That's kind of a far as far as I'm concerned, not this is not anything to do with the book. That's kind of like a cover story as far as I'm concerned. We know because of the black market of everything that they do, they don't need actual legitimate ways of generating a profit, but they have to have a story. So to me, that sounds like a story. So he joined a bunch of social clubs to make his backroom deals. And Park worked very extensively with Robert Keith Gray. Gray worked with Park and CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson. Along later would come William Casey, who we all know was the future CIA director. So he's working with Park, he's working with Wilson, who at the time is a CIA person, and collectively, they all work with Aiden Khashoggi, who we know is an arms dealer, Robert Maxwell, who we know is a Mossad agent and works with arms dealers, And the Teamsters, which we know is a hotbed of mafia and radicals and money laundering. And also in this group is BCCI, which we know is the Pakistani bank that was used almost exclusively by world money launderers and to set up shell companies for CIA slash other intel operations. So this is the whole mix of people that this Robert Gray is in bed with, not literally at this point. With this group of people, you never know. Gray was implicated in Koreagate, Watergate, the Page Boy scandal in 1982, which was basically them having sex with Page Boys. And like I told you, you never know with this group, and the Iran Contra. So he's got his fingers in everything. Gray was originally from Nebraska. He attended college in Minnesota. He joined the Navy. He's a Mason. He became friends with Fred Seaton, who was from Hastings, New Nebraska, and owned the local newspaper, and he was very well acquainted with politicians both at the state and federal level, the newspaper guy, Seaton. So, um, Gray would go on to be a state senator. He was Eisenhower's assistant secretary of state. He was a Pentagon assistant secretary of Navy. And then he became kind of a floating special assistant where he was detailed over to the White House as Seaton's special assistant while he was still on the Navy books. And I explained this, but I need to explain this again because this comes up repeatedly. When you see somebody's duty title as special assistant, it's kind of like the hatchet man, the action guy, especially when they're detailed. So if you have someone assigned to the Navy who's detailed to the White House, that means they're doing things in the White House, generally speaking, not 100% of the time, that they don't want attributed to the White House. So they have an out saying, he wasn't in the White House, he was assigned to the Navy. So it's kind of a semi overt, but in many ways covert way of getting around a whole bunch of obstacles in the bureaucracy of DC. I'll just put it that way. That's probably the best way to say it. So that's kind of, and that's different from when you hear assistant secretary of the Navy. That's an actual job. That's a Title 10 civil service job. But when you use the word special assistant, and I'll give you an example. When we had generals who got in trouble, they were assigned as someone's special assistant while they were awaiting non-judicial or judicial punishment. They are put on people's books. So that's one way of using it. Another way of special assistant is if they're in a holding pattern where their promotion board hasn't met yet and their 2 years of command is up and you need to do something with them. You can't leave them in their current billet. So you assign them as someone's special assistant. But it goes a step further when that special assistant is then detailed, and that's the word they use, over to a completely different organization as if they're trying to hide his actual assignment. So you're free to do whatever you want as a special assistant when you're detailed somewhere else because the attribution, which is a big deal in those circles, is non-existent on the organization that you're detailed to, unless it comes out later on that you were detailed there, which they try to avoid. So Gray had clearances and basically while he was detailed to the White House became the gatekeeper of information. And that's going to be important later on in some jobs that he has. So he becomes an expert on crafting information as it goes in and out of the White House executive office. Sherman Adams, who happened to be Ike's President Eisenhower's chief of staff. Adams was the ultimate gatekeeper as far as visitors and information. So Gray worked very closely with Adams in his job as the information gatekeeper. Excuse me. So while he was in this job, Adams and Gray's fellow groupies were Floyd Odlum and George Allen. Floyd Odlum and George Allen were basically the two people that formed um, created the idea of the military industrial complex. Because you have to go back in time. When Eisenhower became president, it was just a few years after the 1947 act that set up the Department of Defense. Before that, we had had a War Department. We had never had a standing army. When we went to war, we came home demobilized and everybody went back to work. We had no standing army. You had a skeleton of people that were planners in Washington, D.C., in the War Department, and a few other locations around that kind of like mothballed military installations, but we had no standing army. So this period of time was the creation of the military industrial complex. So there were lots of deals to be made. Adam leaves abruptly due to scandals, and Gray basically moves in to work directly for Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. And I'm going to remind you here that Nixon, in the future, had everything to do with the consolidation of the Gladio drug network. And you will see as Eisenhower's vice president, this is the critical period in NATO when they were setting up Operation Gladio. Gray works with Casey and a guy by the name of Clark Clifford during this period. Clark Clifford becomes very important. He's a central figure in the BCCI scandal. Clifford was chairman of the First American Bank Shares Bank in Washington, D.C., that was secretly bought by BCCI. Why is that important? BCCI was at the Pakistani bank that was set up basically with seed money from Saudi Arabia. So basically, in kind of a big picture, Saudi Arabia controlled the Pakistani BCCI. Within a few years of its creation, it becomes the seventh largest bank in the entire world because it's money laundering all of the ill-gotten gains from the drug, from the weapons, from the human trafficking network, all through BCCI. They desperately wanted, for money laundering purposes, to get a foot in the door in the US. They couldn't because it was illegal. So they secretly bought three banks, one of which was in DC. The one they targeted to buy in DC was one that a lot of congressmen used. Well, guess what happens when you own congressmen's bank accounts? You get to see who they're paying, how much they're paying, and what they're paying for. It's an excellent blackmail tool. And Clifford, again, was the chairman of the board when BCCI bought First American Bank Shares. So there's no way he didn't know this was going on. So Gray leaves government when JFK becomes president. He goes to a company called Hill and Knowlton. It's a PR firm. And I'm going to generically cast dispersions on PR firms, especially international PR firms. Every single one of them that I've looked in is corrupt. They are basically like the media. They're an extension of the CIA. I'm just going to leave it at that. Because they control information, they create campaigns, like propaganda campaigns, of which the mainstream media is part of. So Hill and Knowlton was created in 1920, right after the time frame in general of World War One, where it's going to be important for crafting history that you have a PR firm in charge of that. John Hill and Donald Knowlton formed the company, and while it was based in Cleveland, it basically operated in DC with politicians. It was hired, BCCI hired them as their PR company because when you're doing illegal shit, you need a PR company. So they became a favorite of the newly created military industrial complex companies there in DC. So they had lots of money to throw around because keep in mind, um, during the time frame that we're talking about in the late 1940s, early 50s, uh, we're coming off of World War II at this point, and there's lots of money that was made in World War II, and the ability to sustain a long-term standing military and garner profits as a result of it requires a standing military, requires a war for you to buy weapons for, and also the ability to not be completely above board because we know routinely that for NATO purposes, weapons going to theaters get skimmed off of, and that becomes a black market opportunity. So there's lots of money riding on this. So John Hill was a member of a group called Air Power League, which were lobbyists for the military industrial complex. Also, he was a member of Aviation Industries Association because remember back when we were doing Anthony Sutton's book reviews, when and I'm just going to take time out here because this is very important contextually. When the monopolies were deemed unconstitutional, they didn't stop monopolizing industries. They just did it in a more creative way. And Anthony Sutton describes how they did it. You create unions that you control, you create trade associations that you control, and you own the business. So every aspect of what they demonopolized is all back under your control. It just doesn't look like it. So you have an independent union representing the people, but you control the union, like Teamsters. That was mafia ran, which the mafia was in bed with all of these international syndicate people, and they basically control it. Well, if you're writing the regulations and the controls of an industry, you own the industry, not just your company in it. You own the entire industry. So we still have monopolies. They're alive and well in the United States. It's just a segmented process. So w- aviation is a brand new industry at this point. So what's the first damn thing they do? They set up trade unions and they set up industry associations. So they monopolized it at the very beginning. That's important for y'all to understand. So, of course, both of these organizations hired Hill and Knowlton as their lobbyist in DC. So, Hill and Knowlton worked with the CIA because, of course, they did. Robert Crowley, who was a CIA asset, used his international network as a CIA cover. So, Hill and Knowlton basically worked with Crowley, who's a CIA agent, and they created international offices. Their international offices, as a PR firm, were basically fronts for the CIA. That's what she's saying. And this is something that I come across in almost every research project we do. I wrote a paper about I I'm so confused at this point. I've written so much. Um, there was a PR company out of the UK that, um, was used by South Africa country, by the prime minister there to sell out his country, and they did it under the auspices of this company working for the prime minister as a PR advocating for help, but at the same time, they were facilitating him robbing his country and putting money in Qatar. So, they're just a front for intelligence. When you see PR, start thinking intelligence. Crowley is suspected of bringing Bush Sr. into the CIA because, again, remember, we're talking about in the 1950s, and it is estimated based on what he was doing and when he was doing it that it was around 1955 that Bush Sr. officially became a member of the CIA. Okay, so Crowley used Bush's Zapata oil as a front for the CIA in the Caribbean. Now, y'all know because I've said this repeatedly. Zapata is the name of a bay in Cuba. Within 12 months of the discovery of oil just off the coast of Zapata, Bush set up Zapata Oil. It was at this exact same time that the effort was reaching a climax at getting shot. Hold on, I'm getting my dictators screwed up. Um, Castro out of Cuba. So it is thought that this was just a game to gain access, as we've seen in every single one of these Operation Gladios. You create terror, you coup the leadership, and while the country's amassed in revolution, the international syndicate swoops down, gathers all of the resources, steals them from the people. You create a wave of human trafficking refugees, and eventually they move on once they've raped and pillaged the country. So this is exactly what was going on in Castro's Cuba. They wanted him out of there so bad because they had lost their staging point for the opium. They had lost their opportunity to steal all of their oil. Um, so anyway, on with the story. When Edwin Wilson added Gray to the CIA company, they created a company called Consultants International, another PR firm. But when they did that, Edwin Wilson is reported that Gray had already been cleared by the CIA, meaning he was already working for the CIA. So that was kind of a news flash for Wilson because he was unaware at the time that Gray was officially a CIA asset. So a whole bunch of people get together and they set up this club. Now, keep in mind, because we've read this throughout Operation Gladio, you have all those dinner clubs, and they call them dinner clubs. They were just like um, meetings for Fabian Society people under the auspices of a dinner club, most often for orgies, sex parties, and blackmail opportunities. Well, we have a club that was set up during this time frame called the Georgetown Club. And it had housed within it people that were on all of the important lobbies. We talked a little bit about the China lobby. Um, all of the same people that are in the China lobby are in the Georgetown Club. Later on, there's an Israeli lobby that's set up. All of those people are members of the Georgetown Club. So within the China lobby, you have You have, the KMT, which is the, another name for the China nationalist and the current Taiwan government. So if you're just joining us, the current Taiwan government was in the 1950s referred to as KMT, and they were ran by Chiang, who was a Chinese nationalist who was fighting against the um, communist and was being supplied by both Britain and the US until they decided that they were okay with China going communist and stopped funding him. So that's when he was first moved out of China to Burma and then moved from Burma to Taiwan. So that's even why we have a Taiwan issue. These people are under the thought that somehow Taiwan is a separate country. It's not. It never has been. It was called Formosa. It belonged to China. It was invaded by Japan and taken over until World War II ended. And then that's when the Chiang people, after they were abandoned by the US and the UK, escaped over there and basically set up a fortress and pretend to be a separate country. So prominent among the Georgetown Club members was Anna Chenault, and we know her from her husband, who was General Chenault of the Flying Tigers. She works for the CIA in a clandestine way. She's a CIA asset. That's probably a better way of saying it. She also works very closely with Taiwan, especially when they were in the KMT was in Burma, because that airlift that we did to Burma that we thought was providing supplies to the people actually was running drugs, just as a heads up, and under the auspices of the Flying Tigers. She also works very closely with South Korea because, of course, we just left the war there, right? Because we went into war in the early 50s in Korea. So and then she also works very closely with the Philippines. And that's very interesting because of a story about this whole area when Japan was, and a shout out to War Hamster for bringing this to my attention. When Japan was going into all of the Asian countries and creating an imperialistic Japan, they were stealing all of the riches from all of these countries. Well, there's a lot of evidence that those riches were buried in the Philippines. So it's very interesting this network that is described of what her so you go into South Korea, or Korea in general, and Taiwan, Burma, Japan, or China, and then Philippines. Huh, that's weird because Philippines isn't anywhere near, I mean, geographically, it's an island way out here. So Claire Chennault, who is the general, created the first American volunteer group, which became the Flying Tigers. And he um, provided aid, which I already mentioned, to the KMT. And he also worked very closely with a guy who we've talked about before named TV Song, Soong. All right. So with that, I'm going to go over here to my book um, and continue because I had made some notes. Claire had close ties to the Roosevelt administration while it was in power. He also had very close ties to the Civil Air Transport, CAT, which was the CIA's air and the follow on Air America and the follow on to that Southern Air Transport. So he had dealings with all of those. And Anna Chenault, his wife, joined the Flying Tigers as the vice president of international affairs because international affairs is how the CIA assets hide in these CIA front companies like the Flying Tigers to go do whatever it is that they're going to do internationally under the auspices that, hey, I'm just a businessman. So they have lots of ties to organized crime. Another company that was involved in all of this was Pan Am, and the Flying Tigers would evolve eventually into an airline called World Airlines, because of course that was their ultimate goal is to take over the world. No pun intended. And Gray would become a member of World Airlines. That's how you know they're all connected. Is you always look at the board members. So Gray's early political mentor um, during this time was Richard Nixon, and we've already talked about that. And Richard Nixon was part of the China lobby because, of course, he was. So Nixon eventually, in the when JFK becomes president, he goes to a private law practice. The private law practice that he joins, biggest client, one of their biggest clients was Pepsi, the Taiwanese interest of which were firmly held by members of the Song, Song family. That's interesting. So the Georgetown Club was created in March 1966. Its main organizers was Gray, Park, Chenault, along with a guy by the name of Henry Preston Pitts, Lawrence Murthan, and General Graves B. Erskine, Erskine. So officially, the purpose of the club was bringing together leaders who had an impact on the U.S. and the world through their work in various businesses, professional, civic, social, and political milieus. So they definitely had an impact. It just wasn't a positive one. So Pitts and Merthen, Merthan, both worked with Gray at the Hill and Knowlton's PR firm. So basically, the the Georgetown Club is functioning kind of as a CIA front, but also very much in a PR venue of creating propaganda. By the time the Koreagate hearings began in the 1970s, Pitts had left H&K and gone to work for, are you ready for it? U.S. Information Agency, the government propaganda machine. You see how it's all related? So the U.S. Information Agency was, when it was first created, a covert operation set up during the Eisenhower administration to direct public diplomacy and Cold War propaganda. And we just thought that was all illegal. Well, it's not anymore, obviously, we know that because of Obama, but Erskine had a lengthy career in the world of intelligence, and keep in mind, he's military, and covert operations. In 1950, he ran the military wing of the survey mission to Southeast Asia, which turned into the Vietnam War. He was also part of the China lobby. He worked closely with the National China, which is Chiang, and the KMT in Burma. He also worked closely with Thailand. This was when, and we've covered this operation before, Operation Paper, which marshaled the resources of CIA operatives such as mob linked bankers and Halliwell. Arms flowed to Thailand and Burma aboard ships chartered by Sea Supply, which was CIA, that Halliwell organized, while others were procured through shadowy World Commerce Corporation, an arms CIA operation. Operation Paper was a key point in the development of U.S. international complicity in the global drug trade. And we've came across it many times in Operation Gladio. A major instance of intelligence indirect support for drug traffickers. So, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, all part of Operation Gladio. Operation Paper was a subset of that. Because keep in mind, all of these drug trafficking, weapons trafficking was to generate dollars, money laundered to create the money because all this is black world stuff for Gladio operational supplies and terror activities. In 1953, Erskine became the director of special operations at the Department of Defense. He was in charge of an obscure office within the Pentagon that served as a liaison between the armed forces and the CIA. And many of y'all have read the book from Colonel Prouty. He was the precursor to him. Erskine oversaw an ever increasing number of covert operations and special wars dotting the globe. Operating under him was the infamous Edward Lansdale, who was a colonel at the time. He eventually becomes a general. America's architect of guerrilla warfare and psychological operations in the post war era. And mysteriously, Erskine suffers a heart attack in 1957. And Lansdale, who is directly tied to the CIA, many people believe he actually was a CIA asset parading as a military officer, steps in and takes over his job embedded in the Department of Defense. Is that crazy? So, back to the Georgetown Club. You have all kinds of skilled covert intelligence operators in this club. Norman Larson. Larson had previously worked in the Washington offices of a company called Lifeline Foundation. It's a charitable body owned by Texas oilman and financier H.L. Hunt, which was in bed with Bush, not literally, but financially. Well, we don't know. Definitely financially. Other recipients of Hunt's largesse included Foreign Intelligence Digest, a private intelligence magazine organized and edited by Douglas MacArthur's former intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby. And we come across Willoughby a lot in Operation Gladio. Willoughby operated far from the Georgetown Club, but definitely in concert with it. David Clayton would write that the lobby, the Georgetown Club, China Lobby Network, was intricately tied to advocates of a foreign policy rollback that, excuse me, was being worked through MacArthur's chief of intel, General Charles Willoughby. It was also written that Willoughby was a China lobby ally. Others wrote, quote, others who used Joseph McCarthy to settle old scores included the Chinese nationalists of the China lobby, their spokesperson, Alfred Kohlberg, and General MacArthur's Prussian born intelligence chief in Japan, General Charles Willoughby. There's that Prussia thing again. The network can also be illustrated by Norman Larson's membership in International Youth Federation for Freedom, unquote. This was labeled a nonprofit anti-communist group. And immediately when we see anti-communist group, you need to be thinking Operation Gladio, because basically what they're saying is it's a fascist group in support of Operation Gladio that appears to have some working relationship with the CIA because it's a CIA entity, Operation Gladio. The International Youth Federation for Freedom was founded by none other than Tunson Park. Remember that? The Korean guy at the beginning? Yeah, he set that up. He also worked with a old college roommate called Douglas Caddy. Park, during his Koreagate testimony, made a reference to Caddy, saying Caddy, who would appear later in the course of the Watergate scandal by serving briefly as E. Howard Hunt's attorney, small, small world, had been the executive director of Young Americans for Freedom. Young Americans for Freedom, we also talked about, had been organized by a former CIA officer and friend of Roy Cohn and National Review founder William F. Buckley, who we know was part of the CIA. See how that all comes together in one paragraph. We go in thinking, oh, hey, this has nothing. Oh, look, this is a nice youth organization. Oh, dang, anti-communist. That sounds like Gladio. Oh, oh, it's set up by the CIA. So it's definitely Gladio. All in one paragraph in a book that if you didn't know anything about Operation Gladio, that would just go right over your head. Charles Willoughby, the intel guy from MacArthur, from the Southeast Asia military, is on the advisory board of this organization. Because, of course, he is. When Park mentioned Caddy in his testimony, it was during a line of questioning concerning a man who later figured heavily in clandestine espionage activities of Robert Maxwell. That person is Senator John Tower. Tower, who of course is a member of the Georgetown Club, was very close to Park, and Park is quoted as saying, "I was a friend of the Tower family." He goes on to say, this is Park during his testimony, helping young Americans for freedom, which was founded by one of my closest friends, unquote. And it is believed that closest friend is Caddy. But who knows? Could be William Buckley. Regardless, it's a CIA operation. The State Department telegram concerning the Georgetown Club reports for the first 6 years, it never showed a profit. It never had that much fundraising. So obviously, it was being kept alive for something other than raising money as a CIA front. The governing board was divided equally between Republicans and Democrats because it's a uniparty. They're both in on it. It also stated that Clark Thompson had been serving as chairman of the club's board. Thompson was a moderate Texas Democrat who was known for working both sides of the aisle. Thompson's affiliation reveals links to worlds of organized crime and intelligence. Thompson was married to the daughter of William Lewis Moody Jr., a key player in the world of Texas finance and insurance. And what do we know about insurance? Trust, insurance, and bank. Got to have all three. A key player in the world of Texas. Okay, so the insurance company was American National Insurance Company, ANICO, founded in Galveston in 1905. Moody's grandson, Shern Moody Jr., was a close friend and client of Roy Cohn. They described Moody as eccentric, and Moody supplied Cohn with many little boys of the night at his Texas ranch. Thompson had served on the board of ANICO's treasurer during the 1920s. At the same time that he was, no, oh, so he then departed that treasurer's job and moved on later to be the chairman of the Georgetown Boys. Ah, oh, that whole little boys thing just throws me off. Sorry. Um, he becomes the chairman of the Georgetown Club. He had rekindled ties to those people and is listed um, as its official lobbyist. Morris Shanker, best known as Jimmy Hoffa's attorney, was also Aniko's attorney for a time. He helped bring the insurance firm into the mob dominated world of Las Vegas hotels and casinos. Aniko funneled untold millions into the Los Angeles gaming interest, including 13 million to Shanker himself. Most significantly, to Harvin Dorman, the company that owned the Stardust, Aladdin, and Fremont. E. Perry Thomas, the man credited with establishing the Las Vegas Strip, was closely aligned with Mariner and George Eccles, Eccles, the offspring of a prominent Mormon banking and construction family. Mariner served as President Roosevelt's Federal Reserve chief. George Eccles maintained a spot on the board of Anico, and all of this occurring in close proximity to the organized crime of the entire casino industry. So that she's just building, showing you how intertwined what you think are normal businesses are with the criminal aspect. And it's everywhere. And she has done such a great job of weaving this web. George Eccles was also affiliated with American Bankers Life Assurance Company, which was located in Miami, where CIA Paul Helliwell served as its general counsel. America Bankers Life was used by Helliwell as his headquarters for the Sea Supply operation, which was a CIA drug smuggling. In addition to this important CIA linkage, American Bankers Life was connected to Miami National Bank. And we learned in chapter 1 that Miami National Bank was identified in 1969, that between 63 and 67 was a money laundering bank for Meyer Lansky's couriers, and they would channel the money to Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. So that's the web. Okay. And it's all tied to Tungsten Park, who is a Korean CIA agent. I don't know in reality just how independent South Korea's CIA entity is. Um, for all intents and purposes, it appears from what I've learned, a lot of these are subsets as opposed to separate entities. Um, but that's not part of the book. So this whole network through Tungsten Park, who his mission is compromising U.S. political figures, is important to understand as a bigger picture. So this club, and it puts the CIA in the perfect position to monitor all the club's comings and goings. So you have Edwin Wilson, a man who would become known as a rogue agent about 10 years later, after he was linked to various terrorist and assassination plots. Everybody scream at the same time, Operation Gladio. Wilson's early career in the CIA entailed operating undercover as a staffer for the American Federation of Labor. Oh my gosh, not the AFCLI CIO. Yes. So he was a CIA asset embedded in the, because it goes right back to what I told you at the very beginning. The entire network it's an international syndicate. I didn't make up that term um, on the fly. It's all tied together. So the agency and the AFL-CIO worked very closely together. The CIA oftentimes subsidized the AFL-CIO's foreign wings because they were embedded in them undercover. Because, and let me just make this, since we're doing the overlay of Operation Gladio onto this book, almost every single coup worldwide starts with a labor issue. Light bulb go on? Almost every single coup starts with a labor issue. They foment chaos. It ends up in a town square, like in Ukraine a couple of different times. People get shot, like we read about in Greece, like happened in Chile, like happened in Peru, like happened everywhere. People get shot. They disband the government and install a dictator. But I digress. So, Wilson worked in the office of Paul Hall, the head of AFL-CIO's Maritime Trades Department. That's very important too because of the control of supply and the shipping of drugs. Paul Hall worked for the CIA, involved the management of proprietary firms, many of which operated in the world of shipping, freight, forwarding, and logistics. That's how they come up with their drug smuggling networks. One of these companies was called Maritime Consultants. It was set up in DC with CIA funds. Quote, within months, he was chartering barges to Vietnam, arranging cover in commercial businesses for CIA agents, and setting up businesses all around the world. Using his maritime cover, Wilson did detailed surveys of nearly every port in Africa and the Pacific. Unquote. Wilson's involvement in the Georgetown Club had less to do with monitoring the activities of Gray, Park, and Chenault, and more to do with managing the complexities of these covert maritime operations. And don't forget that Gray served time in the Navy. Wilson's business in Vietnam would have gained considerably from contacts with Anna Chenault via the Georgetown Club. The arrival of Wilson at the Georgetown Club marked the beginning of a long association between him and Gray. They took trips to Taiwan. Wilson gained lucrative contracts from the nationalist Chinese military, the KMT, the people that eventually are the government of Taiwan. Gray signed on the Taiwanese government as a client. So again, you've got basically a CIA asset being the PR spokesperson for the Taiwanese government. That's how we get manipulated. The account entrusted to George Murphy, who was an actor who became a U.S. Senator representing California. So George Murphy is working at the PR firm H&K, Hill and Knowlton, and he was an actor, U.S. Senator. So Gray routed the work through a separate company that he had set up specifically for this purpose. And that company was called GM, which people believe meant Gray Murphy. And according to Wilson, Gray set up GM to handle the Taiwanese account separately. Since Anna Chenault trusted Murphy, Gray put the senator in charge of the GM account. Murphy, unsurprisingly, was also a member of the Georgetown Club. Wilson and Gray's joint activities dovetailed with those of the CIA. Gray was a board member of Consultants International, a firm that Wilson managed from offices adjacent to H&K on K Street at the Capitol. Gray later disavowed knowing Wilson and stated that he had been added to the board without his knowledge. Sure, I'm sure he did. H&K employees and Wilson himself have pushed back against Gray's um, denial, saying Consultants International was not simply a consultants firm, it was also an agency proprietary firm set up as a successor to Wilson's earlier CIA front company, Maritime Consulting. So you have Gray, Wilson, Park, and all of the China lobby activists, the intelligence operations, all inside of the Georgetown Club. So they were also involved in eavesdropping and blackmail as part of the club's covert mandate. Future Reagan National Security Advisor Richard Allen, who would have known Gray through their affiliation with the Heritage Foundation, hello, said that the club was bugged, the Georgetown Club. So that's a reoccurring theme, whether it's the Blue Suite or the homosexual bugging and cameras, that they're almost every single entity that they set up is for blackmail purposes and coordination purposes. So another author wrote in a book called Secret Agenda that he was informed in a letter from Frank Turple, Wilson's longtime partner, that Wilson had used the club to collect dirt on prominent Washington politicians and businessmen by using it as a place to arrange trysts for the politically powerful. He quotes saying people could easily be coerced by living out their sexual fantasies in the flesh. These occasions were permanently recorded via selected cameras. The technicians in charge of filming were TSD personnel. The unwitting porno stars advanced in their political careers, some of whom may still be in office. You may now realize the total ineffectiveness of any watchdog committee assigned to oversee clandestine operations. Because, as we knew with the Warren Commission and all the rest of them, and they openly say that if there's a committee formed, it's to bury the information, just like what we saw with the January 6th committee. It is illustrating to you in real time just how dysfunctional all of this shit is and how it's been that way forever. Every committee buried more than whatever eventually came out because of it. It's that way by design because they own everybody. The former Nebraska State Senator John DeCamp, God bless him, who discovered all of the Franklin boys scandal, alleges that Gray was the closest friend in Washington to a guy by the name of Harold Anderson, who was the publisher of the Omaha World Herald and who played an intricate role in the Franklin cover up scandal, which we all know was a nationwide pedophile ring that DeCamp exposed that was linked back to Larry King and tied to George H.W. Bush's White House in ferrying in loads of children into the White House. So DeCamp asserted that Gray himself was reportedly a specialist in homosexual blackmail operations for the CIA. DeCamp also wrote that sexual blackmail operations in which Gray's associate Edwin Wilson was intimately involved were apparently continuing the work of a reported collaborator of Gray from the 1950s named Roy Cohn. Cohn and Gray reportedly knew each other, but the exact nature of that relationship is difficult to figure out. They certainly intimately acquainted during the Ronald Reagan administration in the 1980s, where both men worked closely with William Casey, who was Reagan's campaign manager and subsequently the CIA director. Shortly after the campaign, Cohn, Gray, and Jeffrey Epstein would all take on arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi as a client at the dawn of the Iran-Contra affair. Dun, dun, dun. So, CIA blonde ghost, who we've talked about before. Edwin Wilson ostensibly left the CIA in 1971. Common story involves his commercial cover being blown by a Soviet asset. So, during the course of the manhunt for Wilson and his subsequent imprisonment, Wilson is said to have cut ties with the agency. Sure. And become a covert private operator as a rogue agent. That's the CIA's cover story for when one of their guys F's up. Evidence released not only during his trial, but well after its conclusion shows that Wilson remained in close contact with a cadre of CIA officers and officials whose activities, as the 1970s continued, the agency was battered by reformist efforts. They failed. This circle was centered around the man known as the Blonde Ghost, we all know as Theodore Ted Shackley. He features prominently throughout Operation Gladio. Shackley, like Wilson, came from a background somewhat different than the usual CIA leadership. They tended to come from the elitist, but Shackley came from Florida, not the Northeast, and began his career in the Army. He was recruited into the CIA from the Army Counterintelligence Course, which all of y'all who followed me on the Operation Gladio, that's the CIC that worked very closely with the OSS, which was the precursor to the, although there's some rivalries there. By 1953, he was working with William Harvey at the West Berlin CIA station. And Shackley had been in Germany during an earlier period. Shackley operated at the very frontier of the Cold War as part of Operation Gladio. She doesn't say that, I'm just telling you. So Harvey managed a CIA assassin team, Operation Gladio, with many of its members having been mob hitmen recruited into the agency in an organization called ZR/Rifle Program. Harvey's assassination activities was woven into Operation Mongoose, a joint CIA Army covert war against Castro. At the center of that was the Miami station called JM/Wave, which offices was ironically on the University of Miami and employed anywhere from 300 to 700 agents and 2,000 to 6,000 former Cubans. So Shackley became JM Wave station chief, and Shackley was mentored in the fine arts of covert financial activities by none other than Paul Helliwell. So Helliwell helped Shackley set up fronts like Zenith Technical Enterprises, which was a perfect cover for JM Wave operations. Helliwell was instrumental in helping to direct the network of CIA undercover operations and proprieties. One of the only declassified CIA documents to mention Helliwell is a list of files removed from internal circulation in order to avoid turning them over to the Watergate investigators, which is how you know the CIA was behind that entire thing. Another coup. There's just so many. I told somebody the other day, I think I'm up to a little over 100 if you go through all of Operation Gladio all over the world to include the ones they've taken out here. Um, you're well over 100. So, another guy that was involved in JM Wave with Shackley is Thomas Kleins. He was a key player in the Iran Contra, which we'll talk about in a follow-up chapter. Klein served as Shackley's deputy. Another Cuban exile that worked with them was Felix Rodriguez. He's known for his involvement in the death of Marxist revolutionary Che uh, Guevara. He also had a role in Iran Contra, and she lists some other people. In 1966, the blonde ghost, Shackley, was made the CIA station chief in Laos. And that's where we covered him in some of our Operation Gladio. There was also the term they used for assassination is wet works. So he was involved in assassinations and black ops in the secret war that's no longer secret in Laos and Cambodia. And that was all about running drugs and taking over what had been the French supply of opium. Also, gold that was coming out of that area. So let's see what else we got. Um, the Operation Haylift, which dropped saboteurs deep into the jungle of North Vietnam, and that had to do with the raw opium trade that was at various times. It was either taken to Hong Kong, it was taken to Thailand, for furthering to the refineries that they were using, generally in France and in Sicily. So this circuit, American organized crime figures such as Meyer Lansky had his financial agent, John Pullman, who flew into Hong Kong reportedly to investigate the increasing wartime trade. But of course, we know that they were not there to investigate anything, they were there to facilitate it. Also, Santo Trafficani, who was the mob boss out of Tampa, flies into Hong Kong because Hong Kong heroin was part of the mafia's distributors coming into the US. So Whitney wanted to highlight the fact that Trafficani was traveling over there. He was also part of the anti-Castro operations, and he's part of the mafia. So it ties the blonde ghost, Shackley, to the mob. And supposedly, Shackley actually introduces Trafficani to the heroin warlords in Laos and also is seen with him in Saigon. So it's clear that that's a network. That she goes on to talk about the air logistics for the opium trade were further improved in 1967 when the CIA and USAID gave the Vietnamese financial assistance in forming his own airline called some port. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But basically, they're setting up all of their front companies under the guise of local ownership in order to facilitate the drug trade. That's what the entire Vietnam War was all about, securing a source of drugs to pay for Operation Gladio. So later on, this group that they set up over there with Laos and Vietnam is called Shackley's Private CIA. One of the Iran Contra co-conspirators, Richard Secord, who also was an Air Force officer, had been detailed to the CIA's Laotian station, and he personally knew many of those involved in the trafficking of opium via the airways, including the aforementioned Air Marshal Kai. The Iran Contra affair also had Shackley and Laos working with Major John Singlaub, Singlaub, who also worked with Paul Helliwell back during the OSS days. So, just so that y'all understand, in the military, the way the CIA was set up was we were not supposed to be part of their actual operation. We were supposed to provide air support to and from. So, at no time was our officer corps supposed to be integrated, fly missions, or we were supposed to be a logistical element in support of what operational things they may be doing. You can see that through all of this conversation, both in Gladio and what we're going to go through here, our military officers were not in a logistical support mode. They were buried in the operations, illegal operations of the CIA repeatedly and never said a word. Okay. So we have another part of CIA's air operation. So Edwin Wilson's involved in this, CIA's Air America, James Cunningham, who reported directly to Shackley, is part of this. And then we get back to um, the Gray Park Chenault and other China lobby plus Georgetown Club members, all wired into the world of intelligence that lobbied for the escalation of the conflict in Southeast Asia, eventually resulting in the Vietnam War. In 1968, Shackley took over the Saigon CIA station and created the Phoenix program. The Phoenix program was financed by the CIA under Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, which is a section. Overseeing this mission was William Colby. William Colby, of course, goes on to be the CIA director. Rumors among the military's in-country brass abounded that Shackley exerted influence over Colby through sexual blackmail. Clearly, Shackley and Wilson alleged to have carried out similar activities at the Georgetown Club. Colby, then married to his first wife, returned to Vietnam without his family from a stint back in Langley. According to a retired Army colonel who served in Vietnam, Colby had a girlfriend, a Vietnamese senator's wife. Shackley's colleagues soon realized that Shackley was keeping a book of private lives on all his superiors in Vietnam, including Colby and military officers such as General Abrams, who, according to this colonel, was involved with a Vietnamese woman as well, General Abrams. If pressed upon by an undesirable topic by a colleague, Shackley would warn him off by mentioning their personal entanglements. He was good at letting you know he knew that he had something on you and that he had an edge. Shackley remained in Saigon until 1972, where he took over the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division. And that's when he becomes involved in a whole bunch of other Gladio operations as well. So the agency's eyes were darting further south towards the southern cone countries like Chile, where socialist leader, they call him socialist, but you can argue whether he's a nationalist or a socialist leader. Salvador Allende had come to power. And of course, Shackley was in charge of the coup that brought Pinochet to power in Chile, and 50,000 people get murdered. Shackley left Saigon, and Thomas Kleins, who would soon be embroiled in the agency's ventures in Chile as well, had left Saigon in 1970 and rotated back to the States to attend Naval War College. That's where he meets Richard Secord, who was completing his college thesis, and that thesis was called "Unconventional Warfare: Covert Operations as an Instrument of U.S. Foreign Policy." I probably need to look that up. Kleins kept in contact with Edward Wilson on the goings on of CIA, and Klein brought Wilson into the realm of naval intelligence by way of a secretive unit called Task Force 157. The groundwork for what became Task Force 157 was laid in 1965 by Johnson's Secretary of Navy, Paul Nitze, Nitze. It was titled Instructions for the Coordination and Control of Navy's Clandestine Intelligence Collection Program. Nitze's program for the HUMINT gathering apparatus was originated with plans made by Admiral Rufus Taylor. That's quite a name. Taylor had served in the Office of Naval Intelligence as well as the National Security Agency. In 66, this new Navy unit was being prepared for action. He took up a post as Deputy Director of DIA. Later that same year, he would become Deputy Director of the CIA under Richard Helms. The first iteration of the Navy's HUMINT unit, established in 66, was Naval Field Operations Support Group, and it was referred to as Task Force 90 or 98, a Navy program that supported the Southeast Asian paramilitary activities carried out by Ed Lansdale and Lucien Koenig. And Lucien Koenig we ran across repeatedly in Operation Gladio in that theater. The support group was given the mandate to establish a worldwide intelligence collection organization while preserving non-intelligence attribution of collection operations. So, hence, because they wanted to keep it covert, they created the label Task Force 157. Its primary focus was, get this, intelligence information on communist bloc naval and shipping information. Operation Gladio. Some subunits were located in ports adjacent to shipping channels and choke points for maritime traffic. Task Force 157, just like the CIA, set up front companies and maintained actual offices pretending to be civilians. Task Force 157 worked closely with the military and CIA in developing improved navigational maps. So this ties back to the one guy that was doing all of the um, harbor mapping for the CIA. Task Force 157 even maintained its own international communications system, which they nicknamed the Weather Channel. Task Force 157 operational autonomy was only partial. It answered both to the CIA and to naval intelligence. The agency, CIA, apparently had the edge for taking information that Task Force 157 developed. Ed Wilson is the man you need it's reported as saying, the CIA for that task force. Wilson, meanwhile, learned of Task Force 157 from Thomas Klein's, presumably with Ted Shackley's network. Soon enough, Wilson was on Task Force 157's payroll. And supposedly he was only getting $32,000 a year, but he becomes a multimillionaire during this time because of black money. This is because Task Force 157 allowed him to keep earnings from the commercial fronts that he set up. He operated as legitimate businesses. Two of these front companies was called World Marine Inc. and Maryland Maritime Company. They were registered in DC and they were ran out of offices labeled Consultants International, which is where Robert Gray sat on the board of directors. One small family. Another company called Around the World Shipping and Charting was based in Houston. That's where Wilson spent a considerable amount of time. Around so Whitney is saying there's no direct ties to Around the World directly with Task Force 157, but they were basically in the same business together. So there is likely crossovers there. Um, so around this same time, you have a relaxing of tensions with the Soviet and China trying to curb the nuclear arms race, supposedly. Um, and that you have Nixon and Kissinger trying to get inroads into China. Alexander Haig at the time was still on active duty and working through the Joint Chiefs of Staff with the CIA. You have Kissinger, who appealed to Admiral Moorer, Moorer, who was then serving as the chairman, who had just previously been the chief of naval operations. And as a result, he was the guy that was in charge of setting up Task Force 157. Moorer arranged for Kissinger to use the Weather Channel to send encrypted messages, excuse me, to arrange the necessary diplomatic back channels to China, um, and basically was working with the KMT China lobby all at the same time. So the next section is called Radford Moorer Affairs. So there's a yeoman by the name of Charles Radford, um, who knew kind of in a weird way a journalist called Jack Anderson. And the bottom line to this whole situation was that there was information um, that President Nixon and Kissinger was working with China that they didn't want known to anybody. And basically, there was a leak that happened. Um, and as it turns out, it was this poor kid Radford that was suspected as, and he later confessed that he had been leaking that information. And all of the people, I just want to kind of go over the players here. Um, you had Moore ends up with the short end of the stick. And what the bottom line to this section was it almost appeared like the um let me get the time frame because I want to be specific with this. it looks like we all know that JFK wanted to put the, um yeah, so we're talking about in the 70s. So we all know that JFK wanted to put the um, covert operation type things back into the military, into the Department of Defense. So it looked like there were unofficial people doing exactly that by the Task Force 157's creation. So obviously, the CIA is going to see this as a challenge to their unhinged covert operations. So it's suspected that this whole thing that that's covered in this section was a setup to expose the naval senior intelligence and the joint staff as being untrustworthy, and how it all leaks out. And if y'all want to go do more research on it, have at it. But for our purposes, it basically is the context of the CIA's jealousy of what seems to be a separate initiative that was furthering the JFK thought of standing up that capability um, in the military branch. And there are contacts that eventually expose it and make them all look goofy, like they can't keep secrets. Um, and many people that are familiar with that believes that's exactly what it was. It was the CIA's elimination of their competition. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Um, the next area is black bags and inside jobs. So in 1972, Jack Anderson, who is the same um, guy that just exposed this competition for the CIA, receives a dossier on William Haddad with information on plans being concocted by a November Group, President Nixon's personal advertising agency, to burglarize the DNC headquarters. So Anderson, for some strange, for reasons that remain vague, appeared to have effectively suppressed this information, and he later mischaracterized the information that was provided to him. Others who were provided information by Haddad took it with a little more seriously. A month before Anderson had been brought into the fold, Haddad had alerted the DNC's head, Larry O'Brien, who in turn put Haddad in touch with the DNC communications director, John Stewart. In late April, Stewart, Haddad, and Haddad's source, a private investigator named A.J. Woolston Smith, met in New York City to discuss the accusation about the break ins. Haddad and A.J. Woolston Smith were by no means strangers to intrigue. There's all kinds of ties with him, with the Kennedy family, um, bureaucratic positions, married a Roosevelt daughter, made a name for himself as a muckraker, blah, blah, blah. Um, Woolston Smith had previously worked for Robert Mayhew's private detective, so that's kind of why they're all in the picture here. Um, Woolston Smith likely came upon the information concerning the DNC via convoluted networks and private investigators, blah, blah, blah. So Woolston's secretary, Tony Shyman, was the daughter of a former police detective, Washington police detective, named Joseph Simon, a convicted wiretapper in his own right. Shyman was the partner of one of John Lynn in a detective agency called Allied Investigators. One of the investigators with whom Shyman and Lynn were allied with was part time investigator Lewis James Russell. Russell supplied tips to Jack Anderson and was employed by the GSS, General Security Services. This was a company hired by the DNC to run security at the Watergate offices. They would have been the ones tasked with handling the information Haddad had provided. Shortly after Haddad notified the DNC, Russell resigned from General Security Services and went to work for McCord Associate. McCord is James McCord, who they listed as a former CIA operative. At that time, McCord was serving as the head of security for a company called CRP, Committee for the Reelection of the President, the fundraising body for Richard Nixon. McCord was one of White House plumbers. The team put together to plug, prevent, and investigate information leaks, which was endemic in a highly paranoid 1970s because they had bugs everywhere. Hello. So you have G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, both of the from the CIA. Um, Yet another CIA guy was Frank Sturgis, and they were all part of the anti-Castro, JFK murder. This is all the same group. And she goes on and talks about how this whole thing ends up being what we now know as Watergate. But what's important to understand in this part is that you have all the same players. You have people that are associated with, like McCord. He had Project Artichoke, a special interrogation program that dealt with chemical substance sensory hypnosis. He was part of MK Ultra. He was part of Bluebird. So all of these people, all CIA assets, you could chalk up Nixon's um, being obviously he was set up. I mean, I don't know of any other way to say that. And you could make an argument, I'm not going to here, but you could make the argument that he is another byproduct of Operation Gladio. Um, because of the people and the players that were involved in the coup to get him out of office. Um, and what I find interesting about that is we know that had Nixon played a huge role in taking the Corsican mafia out of competition with the CIA and their Sicilian mafia in the drug trafficking network into the United States. It was through Nixon working with the French president that they were basically able to roll up the entire Corsican mob. And which, again, this is a reoccurring theme. You look for patterns. Elimination of the competition, which we just saw them take out the Navy admiral who was creating a competing human intelligence network. They took out the Corsican mafia because they wanted to deal with the American dominated Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciana crowd in Sicily. They are notorious for doing that. And at some point, Nixon obviously became unnecessary. And the whole way in which Ford comes to power, who we know is part of the commission to hide the JFK murder. And then we get a Rockefeller in as vice president for the first time ever. All of that um, is part of that whole operation. So I'm going to leave that at that. Then we get to call girls and mobsters. Sorry, same thing. Before I didn't slip. The Watergate scandal was one of the greatest political events in the latter half of the 20th century. It collapsed an entire administration, set off decades of power plays and reform efforts. Yeah, not really, but whatever. You can think what you like. The array of competing explanations and interpretations, even from the burglars themselves. According to James McCord, the reason they broke in was to place listening devices in Larry O'Brien's offices. E. Howard Hunt, meanwhile, suggested the team was being dispatched to Watergate to unearth evidence of illicit campaign contributions made to the DNC by Fidel Castro, which is a lie. Um, FBI never found evidence of the purported bugs, and just the whole thing was a scam. So there is also the issue of unexplained evidence. The most important may be the mysterious key in the possession of Eugenio Martinez. At the time of the burglar's arrest, the lock that matched the key was not discovered. Yet in subsequent investigations, it was found the key fit the lock of the office of Maxine Wells, the secretary to R. Spencer Oliver, whose phone had been tapped. Hugan states that according to the arresting officer, photographic equipment was clamped to the top of Wells' desk. Why would a Watergate burglar have a key to Wells' desk in his possession? And what items of interest to Watergate burglars were maintained in Wells' locked desk drawer? Intimations that something strange had been afoot involving Oliver's secretaries was reported early in the Nightmare, I guess that's the name of a publication, by veteran journalist Anthony Lucas. Alfred Baldwin, a former FBI agent hired by McCord to monitor calls being made by Oliver's phone at a nearby listening post, stated that the secretaries were actively using the phone when Oliver, who was frequently away from the office for long stretches of time, was not present. Some of those conversations were explicitly intimate. No, so spicy that some of the conversations that they were that they had gave rise to confirmed reports that the telephone was being used for some sort of girl service, catering to congressmen and other prominent Washingtonians. Here, Lucas is being deceptive, as the allegations concerning the potential of Watergate connected call girl service do not arise on the basis of the phone calls alone. There was, in fact, evidence that several rings were being operated at nearby Columbian Plaza apartments, adjacent to both Watergate and to a motel where McCord's listening post was located. These rings were overseen by at least two madams, Lil Lori, Lillori, and Helen Henderson. Another woman involved was identified by Hogan as Tess, Tess. Here's what he writes. Besides their location at the Columbian apartment complex, the prostitutes had at least two things in common. The first was homogeneity of their clients. With few exceptions, they were professional men, lobbyists, lawyers, stockbrokers, physicians, congressional aides, and real estate developers. They were among the movers and shakers of the Capitol and included at least one U.S. senator, an astronaut, a Saudi prince, a clutch of U.S. and KCIA intelligence agents. And that's important because that goes back to our Tenzin Park guy, and a host of prominent Democrats. According to a 1971 police intelligence report, the Watergate Hotel was a prime source of their business. To make it more complicated, Lou Russell, who was linked to McCord, was closely acquainted with proprietors of the call girl ring. According to the same author, Russell chose to idle away his leisure time in the apartments at Columbia Plaza. He was a friend to many of the girls, a sometimes customer, a freelance bouncer, and a source of referrals. Russell, however, has been playing an even more important role at the apartments. Philip Bailey, a key figure of incredible importance to the deeper context of Watergate, encountered Russell there with a setup that included recording equipment, cameras, and two-way mirrors. Russell was the Epstein of his time. So, who was Philip Bailey? And why was he so important? Bailey was a DC lawyer that favored the dark side of life. He presented himself as a well connected player, an operative of the Capitol nightlight. He was, to quote another author, Phil Stanford, a fledgling lawyer at the bottom of the DC legal food chain. He was a graduate of the local Catholic University of American Law. He's His self-declared role model was Bobby Baker, a notoriously crooked political fixer of the DNC. Baker himself operated within a constellation of Texas-based businessmen and organized crime figures. His preferred clientele were petty criminals, drug dealers, and prostitutes. So he was right at home in Washington, D.C. So, according to the book Secret Agenda, I'm going to have to get that book. Let me make myself a note. Bailey is described as being close to the call girl that Jim Hoogan referred to as Tess, which wasn't her real name. In a book called Silent Coup, the girl referred to as Tess is identified as Kathy Dieter, Dieter. To make matters more confusing, Dieter was not the girl's real name either. She was actually Erica Heidi Riken, Rikan, a woman between 1965 and 1966 had performed as a stripper at the Washington's Blue Mirror Club that was notoriously located on 14th Street in the district. Riken, like Bailey, was well connected. Her best friend was Maureen Biner, Biner, who at the time was dating John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel. Dean and Biner later married. And she changed her name to Maureen Dean. Isn't that interesting? So her best friend was dating Nixon's White House counselor, who would have known every single thing going on in the White House. Riken and Biner had known each other for many years. That's just crazy. So, for a brief period, Biner, who eventually marries the White House counsel, was married to a man named George Owen, who was the scout for the Dallas Cowboys. Owen had the inside track to the top Texan power players. His personal friends included oil heir Clint Murchison Jr., Bedford Wynn, the offspring of a prominent Dallas family with numerous interests in oil, real estate industry, insurance, and law. Oh, dang, he's missing his bank. Just kidding. Bobby Baker and Jordan McLendon, a prominent radio man and occasional intelligence asset. McLendon's close associates included, interestingly enough, Jack Ruby. What? Yeah. And the CIA officer that was connected to both E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. So they are running a brothel, multiple ones, in DC that's connected directly to the White House. So Maureen writes in her autobiography of a trip to Lake Tahoe that she took with her great friend, Heidi Riken. She's going on vacation with the madam. What's interesting is that their mutual relationship with George Owen and the high flyers of the Dallas, Texas crowd, Maureen and Riken were moving into a circle that overlapped considerably with organized crime. McLendon's friend Jack Ruby was himself an insider and participant in the Dallas criminal underworld, which we've talked about. The Murchison's oil and construction interests deployed as lobbyist Irving Davidson, who was a lobbyist for the CIA. Because I'm telling you, lobbyists are basically PR people, and they're all connected. So this Irving Davidson was connected to the CIA, the FBI, Israel, and crime boss Mark Carlos Marcello, which we came across before in Operation Gladio. The Merkinsons also maintained their own ties to Marcello. Ryken continued to maintain her ties to the site of Dallas even after her move to DC. Bill Stanford reported that in her contact book was Wynn, McClendon, Merkinson, and others from this Texas elite group. Um, Also, one of the names was Fred Black Jr. Black was a close friend of Bobby Baker, who was a close friend of Mo Dalitz from the mob, Johnny Roselli mob, and Clifford Jones mob. Clifford Jones was the lieutenant governor of Nevada, but also connected to the mob. Jones also was a confidant of Meyer Lansky and was involved in his casinos, both in the Caribbean and Vegas. Another name that appeared in her contact book was Ben Barnes, a Texas real estate who had magnate who had served as the state's lieutenant governor between 68 and 73. Barnes' close circle of contacts was Herman Beebe, and they were linked to a string of collapsed savings and loans during the 80s. And remember, that was all about embezzlement. Many of those bore the fingerprints of organized crime and intelligence agencies in basically stealing all of our money. Yet, even in the 1960s and 70s, Beebe was making his rounds. The network of bank and real estate ventures and his escapades were woven very closely to Carlos Marcello mob. Just as Ryken maintained her Texas connections after moving to DC, she also was connected to crime figures. She was involved with Philip Bailey and active in the ring operating across Watergate. She was also reportedly the girlfriend of the mob boss in DC by the name of Joe Neslin. Nesline. Neslin was born in DC in 1913. What a unlucky year. He was first arrested for running liquor. Over the years, he raked in a whole laundry list of arrests um, for illegal gambling, liquor incidences. So he operated an establishment called the Spartan Club, which was done in partnership with another mafia guy, Charles Charlie the Blade Torine. The pair were arrested in 63 for running a gambling parlor in Maryland. So the FBI reported Torine as a collection man for Neslin. They also had interest in Meyer Lansky's casinos in the Caribbean. Nestling, for example, maintained a stake in the Colony Club in London. Um, and Nestling had worked at the Tropicana Club in Havana. So he was one of the guys that got kicked out by Castro. Torini had managed the nearby casino called Capri, and they all were in bed with Santo Trafficani because he also was in charge of that whole casino racket down there. Neslin and Taurine co-owned a plush Miami Beach house in 1964. It was inhabited by a mafia financier that was a protege of Lansky's, and that guy was involved in all of the money laundering operations for the mob. So, very close circle. Given these sorts of associations, it's noteworthy that George Owen had told Lynn Collandy that he first met Ryken in the mid 1960s in Antigua. He was visiting the island with good friends. Um, one of his friends, Beckley, was a world renowned gambler and bookie. Um, that was a valuable man to the Costa Nostra criminal cartel. And um, let's see. The FBI report says that Charles Turin was dispatched to Antigua to protect Beckley's interests. The same report states that in addition to Beckley, the co-investors in the Miramar, which was one of his investments, was the Genevieve crime family's um, Fat Tony Salerno. Nethlin's DC operation seemed to have been enabled by an extensive corruption of the local police force. What? The DC police force is corrupt? I'm shocked. The FBI report says in late 1962 that there was knowledge by the police department of all of this organized crime and that nothing was being done about it. Basically, that's a summary. It also said, quote, no gambler operates in Washington, D.C. area unless he obtains protection from the Metropolitan Police Department, unquote. So they basically were running cover for the mob and the CIA tied businesses there. And this is overlaying this whole um, gambling thing is overlaying the prostitution thing at this point. So, sometime in 1971, Heidi Ryken came to Philip Bailey with the idea of using his contacts at the DNC to expand the customer base for the call girls. The connection between Bailey and the DNC was Spencer Oliver. So, according to Bailey, he managed to make contact with someone within the DNC and arrangements were made for a call out line to be set up from the offices. The location of this line was purported to be the phone of Spencer Oliver, though he does not appear to have been one with whom Bailey was negotiating. As 1971 goes into 1972, the operation was bearing fruit, reportedly with one client or more a day being set up through the DNC offices. Other clients included men from the State Department, major hotels in town, a private club, I'm sure it's not the Georgetown Club, and the Library of Congress. I'm sorry. Unfortunately for Bailey, trouble was looming on the horizon. The DC police and the FBI raided his home. While Bailey was away, tied up in court, the authorities were busy pulling a variable treasure trove of incredibly incriminating items from his apartment: sex paraphernalia, video recording equipment, and other odds and ends were photographed, home movies, ledgers, contact books, etc. The reason for the raid, interestingly enough, was separate from the complex arrangements running at Watergate and the Columbia Plaza apartment. Bailey was charged with violating the Mann Act, which is better known as the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. The crooked lawyer, it seems, was accused of drugging a university student, taking pornographic pictures of her, and blackmailing her. As the story went, Bailey threatened to dispatch copies of the photos to the school administrators and her parents if she did not submit to the attention of his political cronies and business associates. So she did submit, having sex with 15 consecutive partners at a party hosted by Bailey in suburban Maryland house. So Philip Stanford wrote a book about Ryken and presented a slightly more complicated story about this. He identifies the student as Astrid LeFlame, L E Flang, who Bailey had attempted to recruit into Riken's call girl ring. Riken, however, rejected LaFlame on the grounds that she was too low class and not sophisticated enough for her level of operation. Soon enough, LaFlame was feeling snubbed and began to provide information to the Capitol Police Vice Squad, and that created Bailey's legal woes. So, Assistant U.S. Attorney John Rudy was building a major case against Bailey. By this time, many women had come forward with accusations against the attorney, and there was a ton of potential witnesses. Because of his social networks, the media buzz about Bailey's situation and the seriousness of his crimes was minimal, at least until June 9th, when the Washington Star ran a front page picture headline called Capitol Hill Call Girl Ring Uncovered. The FBI had uncovered a quote, a high price call girl ring allegedly headed by Washington attorney and staffed by secretaries and office workers from Capitol Hill and involving at least one White House secretary, unquote. The article seemed to be alluding directly to Wyken's call girl ring while misconstruing just how involved Bailey was in it. Who exactly tipped off the star is unknown, but it set off alarm bells everywhere. So, attorney John Rudy receives a call from John Dean demanding access to the document evidence involved in the Bailey investigation. Rudy and his assistants were personally summoned to the White House. The evidence, including Bailey's contact book, was packed up and brought to Dean. Rudy would later call Colladini that a would later tell him that a main source of Dean's attention, besides the potential sources for the Star story, was the Black Contact book. Many of the individuals in the book were hidden behind aliases, and two of those were Kathy Dieter and Clout. Rudy had taken pains to confirm the identities behind the aliases. Kathy Dieter was Heidi Riken, while Clout was her girlfriend, Maureen Binder, the woman dating the White House attorney. The time frame of these events is telling. The raid on Bailey took place on April 6, 1972, and a day later, the CRP provided G. Gordon Liddy with $83,000. On April 12th, McCord received a large chunk of this money to purchase electronic surveillance equipment. Howden announced that it was 3 days later, on April 15th, that William Haddad wrote to Jack Anderson for the first time, informing him of the plans to spy on the Democrats. So, in other words, let's go on. The first of the break ins at the DNC took place at the end of May. The Star article and Dean's encounter with Bailey contact book was on June 9th. On June 12th, it was suggested to Liddy another break in, ostensibly for the purpose of acquiring the files of DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien. Magruder, however, had not concocted the scheme out of whole cloth. It had been Dean's idea. Within 5 days, the police was in the DNC offices making arrest and the Watergate. Had Dean ultimately ordered the break-in to obtain potentially incriminating information related to the Watergate Columbia Plaza ring? With the specter of organized crime, chiefly Riken's relationship with Joe Neslin in play, and the rumors swirling around the high-profile Washingtonian prostitution ring, it was certainly an explosive situation. Maybe Dean was hoping to get out ahead of any revelations. There's also the looming question, was there a connection between Watergate call girl ring and the sorts of sexual blackmail operations alleged to have been carried out by Edward Wilson? For instance, the trick book maintained by Little Lori Barbara Ralabate reportedly contained the names of Ed Wilson and Tungsten Park because Tungsten Park was part of the Korean CIA. He also writes that the apartment owned by Tess, Heidi Riken, had been rented in the name of Philip Bailey, but was actually being paid for by a wealthy defense contractor and sometimes lobbyist on Hill, who owned a huge farm and claimed to hail from Houston, Texas. Each of these descriptions match Edwin Wilson, who had indeed spent time as a lobbyist, although at the time he was actually working for the CIA. So basically, the CIA has set up a hooker running a call girl scheme in Washington, D.C. That's the way I read it. So if Wilson and Park were indeed connected to the Watergate ring, then it was plugged into a network, excuse me, throat's getting dry, that encompassed the activities of Robert Gray, the Georgetown Club, the internal politics of Task Force 157, and anybody seemingly aligning themselves against Richard Nixon. So it's quite possible. I mean, you could say even that it may have been the unveiling of this um, call girl ring once whatever they were doing in the DNC. You could actually make the argument that when they knew that was going to blow up, that the exposure of the call girl ring took all of the attention away from it. So we know they do that all the time. I'm not saying that's what happened, but these people are so evil that it's important to understand that everything, like, we're going to find out repeatedly through Operation Gladio, through Whitney Webb's book, which I argue is a big overlay of Operation Gladio. These call girl networks have been set up repeatedly for blackmailing, and that's how they control a lot of the operation. And primarily, it's intel agencies doing the controlling. So, another key point in this is a partner at the Houston based firm of Fulbright and Jaworski. Jaworski had populated numerous boards and maintained affiliations with a whole bunch of powerful people. He held a position of trustee on MD Anderson's foundation, which had been established in the 30s to help the now famous medical center. Sometime towards the end of the 50s, MD Anderson became a conduit for funds originating from the CIA. Did you know that? As trustee, Jaworski was aware of the nature of the funds and had signed off on it, as had the foundation president, John Freeman, who was a former partner in Jaworski's firm. The another Houston-based foundation moving CIA money at the time was San Jacinto Fund. That guy's name was Ernest Cockrell Jr., a board member of the wealthy Bank of the Southwest. Um, According to a Texas Monthly article, quote, the partners had their closest and most lucrative relationship with the Bank of the Southwest. In addition to serving the bank's legal counsel, members of the firm dominated the board of directors and occupied top executive positions, unquote. Another bank director was businessman John D. Meanell, then the representative of the Schlumberger oil interest in America. He was also implicated, this Schlumberger, in the CIA anti-Castro Cuban network. So by the time the Watergate scandal had erupted, Jaworski would be found working closely with a veteran of the anti-Castro operations, i.e. CIA, Alexander Haig. The nature of this relationship was so particular that it saw Haig act as a channel for the flow of information to Jaworski, including some which had not been subpoenaed. It seems that Haig was playing a direct and shadow role in developing an overall thrust of the Watergate prosecution. Okay. Then our last scandal is the Page Boy scandal. We're going to go through that real quick. So, the sordid story rumbling between Watergate fiasco was not the only time that Robert Keith Gray's name would come up in connection with sexual blackmail. Don John DeCamp's book, which we talked about, The Franklin Scandal, and his connections to Edwin Wilson due to his close association with Harold Anderson, the publisher of the um, Omaha World Herald newspaper, were all close friends with Larry King. We went over that. Nearly a decade earlier, Gray had serviced in the course of an investigation into a purported sex drug ring that allegedly operated on Capitol Hill. The scandal made a momentary splash in the media, but it was quickly just a footnote. It began when Leroy Williams Jr., a congressional page, they are high school students employed to fulfill various administrative tasks for congressmen, like couriers, made a startling accusation that he had had sex with three House members and procured homosexual prostitutes for a senator. The latter incident was reported as having taken place in the Watergate office complex. Hello. Initial reports suggested that unnamed witnesses came forward with further information on the sexual activities of politician pages, prostitution rings, and drug rings on Capitol Hill. CBS Evening News ran a story on July 30th, 1982, and the hints of drug abuse were quickly linked to arrests that had occurred several months earlier. On April 19th, there's that date again. Douglas Marshall, Robert Finkel, and Troy Todd had been nabbed by undercover Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police for possession of cocaine. Of the three, Marshall and Hinkle were charged with distributing and conspiring to distribute cocaine. Todd and the other accomplice, a young woman by the name of Devon DePries, were subsequently named as unindicted co-conspirators. So now, taken to context what we just said. The entire Metro Police is corrupt. So if they arrested these people for cocaine, they obviously were told to do so. They also were told who to indict and who not to indict. Newspapers described Dupree's as a Georgetown cocktail waitress. It appears that she was an assistant to Michael O'Hara, the owner of the DC discotheque called Tramps. Others stated that she was reportedly socialized with California congressmen now under investigation by drug agents. It was subsequently entered into the Justice Department. Oh, she was, hold on. Quote, reportedly socialized with a California congressman now under investigation by drug agents, and was subsequently entered into the Justice Department's federal witness program and moved to an undisclosed location. Well, that's interesting. This odd cast of characters operated a cocaine ring that employed the services of congressional pages, tour guides, and other Hill employees who enjoyed wide ranging access to congressional members. That would be convenient. Douglas Marshall himself had been a page, while Robert Finkel had worked as an elevator operator in the Capitol. On July 7th, Jack Anderson, see how often that guy's name comes up, reported that more than 15 members of Congress were customers of a cocaine ring that operated on Capitol Hill. The ringleaders have told narcotic agents, unquote. He also appeared on ABC Nightline with Sam Donaldson, publicly linking the cocaine ring to alleged prostitution and sexual abuse. Here's a back and forth. Donaldson, all right, Jack, tell us what the page set up. Did you actually catch some pages involved as couriers? Mr. Anderson replies. There were some pages involved, but the drug scam changed into a sex scam later. I know very little about the sex angle of it, except that the same people were involved. Some of the same people, Donaldson then says. But pages were acting as couriers for a dealing of drugs? Question mark. Mr. Anderson says. That's correct. So were congressional aides. By the time that Anderson was making these accusations, an FBI investigation and House Ethics Committee inquiry had formed to assess the possibilities of sex and drug rings on Capitol Hill. Oddly enough, old Watergate familiar John Califano was put in charge of the inquiry. Califano's team employed a score of lawyers and investigators, including two private investigators, Richard Power, a former New York City police officer, and Jack Moriarty, a former DC police officer. Gray's name came up in the inquiry from an anonymous tip, which was handled by Powers, who drafted a memo on it to Califano. The memo quickly disappeared. The lead to Gray arose on July 21st when Ethics Committee counsel Donald Purdy and John Moriarty interviewed yet another figure from the Watergate days, DC officer Carl Schaffler. Schaffler turned over the extensive information that he had compiled on Gray, his links to Edwin Wilson and the CIA, rumors of his involvement to include the use and distribution of narcotics, wild tales of orgies taking place in his home in Rehoboth Beach. Huh, Rehoboth Beach. Isn't that where Biden's house is? The most alarming allegations made by Schaffler, however, was that a consultant for Diamond Shamrock, a major Texas based oil and gas concern, and a local photographer personally known to Gray was involved in a male prostitution service on Capitol Hill. Diamond Shamrock was at the time a client of Gray and Company, an independent PR firm set up by Gray. Several weeks after he provided this information to Purdy and Moriarty, Schaffler was contacted by a security specialist with a longtime intelligence ties by the name of Michael Pilgrim. Pilgrim wanted to know if Schaffler had been hired by H&K, the Gray outfit, to keep tabs on their former executive. Pilgrim, in turn, had been asked to assess Schaffler by Neil Livingston, yet another strange character in this murky Netherlands of intel in the Beltway. Livingstone, who will be discussed at greater length in the next chapter, was at the time working for Gray at Gray and Company, not at H&R. While also maintaining extensive ties to the circle around Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, and Edwin Wilson that went back to the 70s and the CIA. The arrival of Livingstone on the scene raised even more puzzling questions, as Sue Trento asked, how did Livingstone find out that Schaffler had received allegations about Gray? The day after his encounter with Pilgrim, Schaffler was contacted by Thomas Fortwin, Gray's attorney. It was an interesting choice for an attorney, as in 1981, Fortin had taken over from Roy Cohn as the chief attorney for Tony Salerno, the boss of the Genevieve crime family. These ties may have ran deep. Gray was reportedly a friend of Cohn. A year after the Page Boy scandal broke, Salerno arranged for an appointment of Jackie Presser as president of the Teamsters Union. Presser was a client and associate of Gray's. The two may have even owned a mysterious company together called Member Services Corporation. Fortune offered Schaffler the opportunity to interview Gray with the clarification that Gray would deny any allegations that Schaffler made to Purdy and Moriarty. He then added that the Moriarty himself, who had turned over the information to Gray's associates, It was an incredible conflict of interest. In addition to working on the ethics committee probe, both Moriarty and Powers were moonlighting on behalf of the Gray Company. Powers himself was a longtime associate of Fortune's who had employed Powers as his private investigator. In a subsequent meeting with Powers, Schaeffler himself was offered a job working for Gray at a very lucrative salary, trying to buy him. Schaeffler saw this as an attempted bribe and reported it to the U.S. attorney. Very soon, a sweeping Department of Justice investigation was underway. Sweeping. September 28, 1982, the New York Times ran an article stamped with the title, Califano suspends two investigators in Congress sex and drug inquiry. These two investigators were identified as Powers and Moriarty. Califano did not return repeated phone calls. The Justice Department decided to decline to disclose the nature of the charges. So after Moriarty and Powers debacle, the entire episode came to a close. Much more quietly than it had began, more questions than satisfied answers. In the final ethics report, Califano cited evidence that the U.S. Capitol Police had systematically destroyed documentary records relating to drug trafficking on the Hill, including vital documents put together in the critical months of July 1982 when the accusations first began to gain momentum. While the report suggested that disciplinary action in connection with this destruction was warranted, none was taken. The allegations of sexual abuse of pages and homosexual prostitutions were also swept under the table. Leroy Williams, the page who first came forward, suddenly recanted. He told investigators working on behalf of the Ethics Committee that he had concocted the tale of sexual misconduct and drug use to draw public attention to the pressures of the page system. Importantly, the congressman whom he had claimed to had sex, Larry Craig of Idaho, was himself a member of the House Ethics Committee. In 2007, Craig was arrested for propositioning the undercover police officer in the Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport. Is that crazy? That's freaking crazy. Sorry. You just can't make this shit up. So the Capitol Police has always been rotten. The DC police has always been rotten. There is no justice in Congress, and they are above the law each and every time. You can run entire prostitution networks. You can have drug deals everywhere, and they probably all still do today. And they're probably all still ran by the CIA, and they probably all have blackmail material on all of them. And that's the reason why all of this is happening. That's why no one does anything, because there is no one that's exempt. They got dirt on everybody. So let me go through my comments here real quick. Undercover without a. You're right, Lucy. When you read undercover, that's exactly what you. So I think the beauty of this is, to me, what we're doing here today is breaking MK Ultra programming, right? So now every time we see the word anti-communist, you think Operation Gladio. When you see undercover, you know immediately that it's a CIA operation, and everything that comes out of it after that word is a lie. Um, oh, is that right? Is Ghislaine Maxwell's organization Miramar? You know what? I think you're right. I need to make a note of that. Um, that's very interesting catch. Y'all are so smart. I love doing this. Um, oh my gosh, Bridget, you're just a gold mine, aren't you? Thank you so much. And Julie, thanks for putting all the names down for anybody that wants to go research these people further. And I highly recommend you do. If y'all do that, put your stuff on Truth Social like Bridget and Julie does in Raven, and I will broadcast that to everybody. I want all of this information out. So please just tag me in it and I will redo that. Um, If you don't see me do it within 24 hours, Julie has all my contact information. Go, hey, Julie, nudge her. This is excellent. Thank you guys so much, Julie, for passing on these articles, and you too, Bridget. Y'all, I just could not do this without you. Thank you so much. Um, Cesspool of white collared criminals. You're right. I don't think that there is a successful Terramar, Julie. There you go. Thank you. So I'm gonna cross that out. Otherwise, I'll be going to look that up. I don't honestly think they're Liza. No, girl, I love you. Um, Liza is kind of my, one of my sanity, uh, checks when I think I'm going over the deep end, um, and her as well. She does excellent research. She comes up with excellent, points, and, we DM a lot on Truth Social so that she's like, "Hey, did you see this?" Or, "Hey, I think this needs to be said." And, again, absolutely critical to the mission. Yes, I love you, chop liver. Technically, I hate liver, but whatever. Um, so anyway, is there anything going on that anybody wants to discuss real quick that's not necessarily on this topic? But the just so everybody has a heads up, our next chapter is called A Private CIA, and it is very, very interesting. Um, oh, sounded right at a quick thought. Um, so there's so much stuff going on. I don't know if y'all had a chance. I do want to cover this real quick. I'm not going to cover the whole thing. Let me pull it up. That 40 Head um, did an article, and I did make the comment about it's just so frustrating that people um, are talking about the let me see, uh, Operation Gladio stuff without calling it um, Operation Gladio, and that is a little frustrating for me. Um, but I mean, I completely understand it. Um, where is his article? Um, hold on, let me pull it up on my um, Twitter account. I think I can find it easier over here. Uh, real. Here it is. Okay, let me put my glasses back on so I can see it. I might be able to blow it up. All right, here you go. So, in this thread, and it is a very long thread, but he's talking about people in 2019, and keep in mind, obviously, that's after Trump becomes president, that there is a mafia slash gang in Italy that we came across as part of Operation Gladio that was two of the people were arrested in Brazil. And you remember that a lot of the people, when they would flee from prosecution, they would go either to Brazil or Argentina, anywhere where there was other gang activity that they could kind of hide within. So these people, Nicola Assisi and his son Patrick, was arrested in Brazil, and they were part of the Calabria mafia. And we came across Calabria. Thank you so much. Calabria mafia when that was a location where they would kind of hide people that had been caught up in the mafia, and so the he's talking about the and I want to cover the most important part of this. Y'all all remember that when we were doing Operation Gladio, how I was telling you I lived in the 1990s in Italy, and they kept knocking off judges, they kept knocking off prosecutors. They would hold people ransom, like the former prime minister, and then kill them. Anybody, the reporters that would report on stuff, they would murder them. So the biggest thing to me that he points out in his, and let me, I'm going to cut and paste this if anybody wants to look at it. Um, the biggest thing to me that he pointed out was they set up a secret, and this actually was covered in one of the other books that I didn't review. They set up a almost like a Hague in Italy underground where entire families was brought in, that everybody that lived in anywhere close to the judges. So they would bring them in to protect them. So the judges would walk down the hall to their trial. The prosecutors and their entire families were brought in and housed in this huge monster facility. So they were able to have trials there under this auspices of this secret court that um and they did like a basic big RICO. It took years to set up. It said they prosecuted over 350 members of the cartel through this facility. Um, and for those of us who have read about Operation Greylord and how people that were fine were posing as corrupt, and they were gaining information, and people are like, oh, how long is this all going to take? Well, we can see from this that um, it's number one, it's possible. Number one, all of this was going on and no one knew it was happening. This is the kind of stuff, and thank God 40 Head wrote this, that gives all of us, and that's why I want everybody to understand Operation Gladio. Because if you understand the breadth of it and the corruption that has occurred and the length of time that it takes to prosecute all of this, and he ties in some Q drops to it for those of you who follow Q. Um, he talks about how it works with the hunt for Red October, and how Q ended up just dropping the hunt and went for Red October, um, almost like the hunt was over because they were prosecuting this big chunk of the mafia that was involved in the drug trafficking and money laundering. He even brings up the Mancuso family, which was part of this mafia, and the guy in the movie's name was Mancuso. So there, for all of y'all that like those like tie-ins, it's all there. Um, and what I wanted everybody to understand is this is Operation Gladio. This is accountability for and this is just one family within the Italian Gladio network. There's multiple families that are involved in the Gladio network in Italy. So how many times did this happen? He also mentions Cardinal George Pell and how he all thank God. Um, so he also has all of the information about how the Gladio network was using the Vatican for money laundering. Now, y'all know that I took it personal that we lost three of our founding group in the international syndicate thing because we happened to point out the Vatican was in bed with Operation Gladio and money laundering. And this is yet another verification that they, in fact, number one, was involved in that. And he provides an alternative to um, what happened with George Pell, in that I think we're going to find out some different information. George Pell was charged after he began trying to clean up the Vatican money laundering. It's alleged. He was then um, returned to Australia to face um, child molestation charges that was made after he began trying to clean up the Vatican money laundering. That may or may not be true. He may have been involved in other things and they were trying to set him up, but eventually the Australian um, judicial process cleared him of any wrongdoing. So that's the important part of that aspect of it. Um, Also, he talks about the uh, JP Morgan, the Chase Bank, and Bank of America. We know there's way more than that. We know that the Deutsche Bank, um, the defunct. And what's really interesting about the Pell connection to Australia and the money laundering that also touched Australia, and he doesn't mention it in here, is the Nugan Hand Bank that where Nugan gets suicided and Hand goes missing because it was a major partner with the Vatican Bank in money laundering. So I just wanted to add a few details of that. But yay for people talking about this. He also mentions that that there's an element of Freemasonry, but he never mentions the P2 connection. We know who that Freemason is, organization. It's the P2. So I just want to give y'all when you read this, you're gonna, pat yourself on the back for being able to fill in a whole bunch of holes. Also, he mentions The Godfather 3, but not our orange connection, which we also have there. And I did, DM him and fill in a couple of the holes there. So, I highly encourage y'all to read his article. It is a very good article. He posted it both on, Twitter, and I put the Twitter link only because it was easier for me to find, but he also posted that on Truth Social, and I so Deutsche Bank, interesting Vanderbilt connection. Yeah. So I am just finishing up that Vanderbilt video, and I will post a few things on that because I have all of we went to the pink palace of Vanderbilt. We went to the Breakers of Vanderbilt, and we went to Asheville to the Vanderbilt Biltmore there. So we were inside three of those houses this summer. So that's kind of a very interesting having just walked through all of them and read all the little plaques. It was very interesting. Um, Oh, I have pictures, I have tons of them, and I will do a whole separate show once I finish that video on the Vanderbilts, with the pictures, because the pictures are very interesting. And anything that was unique, I tried to take, uh, extra photos of. Um, can you add a Truth Social link? Not I will when we're done. I don't wanna spend the time right now. I'll put the Truth Social link up just as soon as we're done. I need to find his account. Um, so anyway, all very interesting. So, also this morning, Raven posted a connection to some of the things that was happening in South America, where there was another big bust that just happened, and people were just arrested. So I honestly believe that our timing could not be more perfect for having gotten this foundation. So as the arrests start happening, y'all are going to be like light years ahead of everybody else by being able to make the connections. So it just tickles me to death. And it gives me so much hope when we see these things actually being addressed. So hope that helps fill in some holes, learning a little bit more history and just how bad our government is. And we'll be back here in a couple of days for our next chapter. And hope y'all have a nice rest of your day. See you later.